What is happening in Iran? Over the past several days, protests have erupted in more than 20 cities and towns across the country. At least 5 protesters and 1 member of the security forces have been killed. So how serious is this unrest? At this stage, the protests do not pose a direct threat to the regime. Iran has seen repeated waves of demonstrations over the past decade, and each time the authorities have managed to restore control through force. There is no organized domestic opposition, and most protesters appear to be acting spontaneously. While demonstrations could continue or even grow, especially given Iran's worsening economic outlook, the regime still commands a large and experienced security apparatus. It is therefore likely to suppress the unrest without losing control of the country. So far, the protests, while violent, have remained relatively small and concentrated in smaller cities and towns. They began on December 29th with peaceful demonstrations by merchants in Tehran, protesting rising inflation and the sharp collapse of Iran's currency, the rial. Over the following 4 days, protests spread to multiple locations and became more confrontational, with crowds typically numbering from a few dozen to several hundred people. As in previous protest waves, economic grievances have acted as the trigger for broader public frustration. However, the capital has remained largely quiet since the initial demonstrations, and unrest has not reached a critical mass. The government's response has been calculated, signaling some willingness to address economic concerns while cracking down firmly on protesters who cross into openly anti-regime territory. What about the United States? Direct U.S. intervention is unlikely. President Donald Trump stated on January 2nd that the United States would intervene if more protesters were killed. While such rhetoric is unusual and largely unprecedented, it remains unclear whether the administration intends to follow through. In theory, the U.S., possibly with Israeli assistance, could attempt to support protesters inside Iran. But any evidence of foreign involvement would give the regime justification to intensify repression. The absence of an organized opposition also makes meaningful external support extremely difficult. Military action aimed at destabilizing the regime would require a major commitment of resources, given Iran's extensive internal security forces. Given President Trump's preference for limited military engagement with Iran and ongoing commitments elsewhere, such action appears unlikely. There is, however, a separate risk to monitor. Israel could take action if it believes Iran is rebuilding its nuclear or missile capabilities. Looking ahead, the regime faces a deeper structural problem. While it can suppress protests, it remains poorly equipped to address the underlying causes. Inflation, a collapsing currency, unemployment, corruption, inequality, and shortages of food, energy, and water continue to weigh on the population. As a result, public frustration will persist, and protests are likely to keep flaring up. They may not yet threaten regime survival, but they reflect a long-term legitimacy problem that Iran's leadership has so far been unable to resolve.